have, haven't I? Have a look. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before we delve into tonight's just of 15 minutes, we'll have 3 speakers, then an interval, and then the final 3 presentations. We'll round the evening off with a Q&A session. It is with great regret that I inform you that unfortunately John Pilger will not be attending this evening due to illness. On behalf of Frome Stop War, I do apologise, but I'm sure you can appreciate this is a completely unforeseen and unavoidable circumstance, so I do hope you all understand. John has sent a message for everyone. It reads, "Dear all, I had hoped to join you tomorrow evening, but I was being far too optimistic. The bronchitis that came in early this year is hanging on. From past experience, I know it won't lift for a few days more at least. I am very disappointed and so sorry to have let you down. I like the idea of the media on trial, and I very much appreciated the commitment and energy with which you put the event together. Please give my apologies to the audience. I'm sure they'll be rewarded by the contributions of all you fighters for and defenders of real journalism. I read that the BBC's Nick Robinson can't quite understand why the public are rumbling, those paid to keep the record straight. It must have something to do with social media. Surely not the unwatchable, unreadable, and unbelievable media. Even fake news is a corporate brand designed to cover what so much of the mainstream media has been dishing out for years. This makes the media on trial so very important. All power to you, and again, my sincere apologies, John." Well, I'm sure we're all unanimous in wishing John a full and speedy recovery, and also in assuring him that he hasn't let anyone down. John really does epitomise everything a true journalist should strive to be, and I'm sure he's been a massive inspiration to many of our speakers here tonight. So, present or not, he's contributed anyway. So, tonight, Frome Stop War has travelled from its sleepy home in the West Country of England all the way to the Big Smoke to host 6 very special speakers. We're truly honoured to have them all here with us tonight. Our panel this evening hail from a myriad of professional backgrounds, from world-class investigative journalism to academia to public office. So tonight, we all turn our lens and focus upon the corporate media, upon the so-called free press, which should be a cornerstone of any true democracy. For without factual, unbiased reporting, how can we, the public, be made aware of any wrongdoing? Well, the answer is simple: we can't. Without that vital truth, we have no foundation upon which we can build our resistance to this ravenous war machine. So tonight, with the help of our esteemed panel, we shine a light on the dark shadow cast by corporate media as we try to clarify the truth about some of these pivotal geostrategic conflicts. Conflicts which have caused untold misery and hardship for millions upon millions of people. Before we commence with the first of tonight's presentations, John has requested that we show you an excerpt from a conference that he attended, which focused upon the media's complicity in the promotion of war.
There are plenty of people in the BBC and in other organisations that feel the huge disquiet at the role that their newspapers and media organisations play in the promotion of war. In fact, the most powerful media has never been, in my opinion, apart from a brief period when the Sunday Times was attacking programs like Death on the Rock and others, has always been the respectable media, the one with reputation, like the BBC, like The Guardian, the kind of lesser evilism of journalism. And there's often a reluctance to understand that it's in that media in the United States where, speaking of the New York Times and the Washington Post, not Fox Media, these so-called respectable organs of media have, in my view, played a much more important role in promoting all the wretched euphemisms of aggressive war, such as humanitarian intervention. The BBC has played a central role. It's an old story. 1966, one of the BBC's most brilliant mavericks, a young man in his 20s called Peter Watkins, made a film called The War Game, which reconstructed the effect of a 1 megaton nuclear attack on London. Those of you who will have seen it, I'm sure, will have been moved by it, and I've seen it a number of times. That film was viewed by the Lord Normanbrook, I think it was, who was then the sort of Chris Patton of the BBC, immediately took it to the Cabinet Office, to Sir Burke Trend, who was then the Secretary of the Cabinet Office, showed it to him, and a top-level meeting was called between all the top BBC people and Whitehall officials, and they agreed that it was the most brilliant film and accurate and restrained, but that what it would do would cause an unnecessary effect on the attitudes of people, of viewers. You don't have to translate that much. It was a threat. Its truth-telling was a threat. It was an intolerable truth. It told the truth about the prospect of nuclear war and the danger of an attack of nuclear war at the time. So it was banned, and it was the reason it said, the press release said it was not for faint hearts. It was, that ban held for something like 18 years. During that time, every Director General renewed the ban. And I remember there was Syrian Shothaun who said that he was worried of its effect on the elderly and on people of limited intelligence. That almost gave the game away. And when it was finally put out in the 80s, with the distinguished broadcaster Ludovic Kennedy introducing it and perpetuating the lie, hardly anybody then on television really saw it. It was a small audience. Now, that censorship by exclusion and omission runs right through the BBC, which has produced, with the best production values in the world, some of the finest, most refined state propaganda. And until we understand that that's in a way its function. And I'd be here all day going back with many other examples. The Iraq War, the BBC came out worse in the University of Wales study, the media tenor study that put the BBC at the very bottom of those broadcasters around the Western world, that gave any kind of glimpse of an opposing view that represented what the majority of the people, for example, of this country said. It's absolutely structural and endemic. And I think that to understand that, we have to really not allow ourselves to be cornered, put into cosy little liberal corners by even discussions about regulation. I mean, sure, there should be right of reply, and perhaps there might be one day. But as the Guardian letters page fill up with what to me are a bunch of non sequiturs and don't address the fact that that journalism in the so-called mainstream is not addressing the world as it is. And the Petraeus affair is all very interesting, but I mean, Petraeus was an absolutely crap general. By his own light, you can only see by the massive amount of sort of stuff all over him that he'd done nothing. But what Petraeus did do, he did say, and I paraphrase him, that the enemy was not the Taliban, but the enemy was at home. And that's the essence of this, that the enemy was right here, that the enemy is the public in the United States, that the enemy in this country is the public in Britain. He coined the phrase perpetual war. That's his contribution. And we're distracted massively because he had a spot of adultery. Who cares? The fact that this man, it's very easy to call somebody a war criminal because there are so many of them. But this man played a very, very important role in setting up a propaganda model that the Pentagon, which spent in 5 years something like, according to the AP, something like $4.5 billion on public relations, but Petraeus's job was as a public relations man, was to seduce the media, which he did. Have you seen, any of you, by any chance, John Simpson's interview with him? I have regard for John Simpson, but my God, I saw it the other day. And, you know, it was the obsequiousness towards this 10th-rate product of a corrupt military officer class, which is in the United States, which has been sacrificing its young men and women, as well as the civilians it's assaulted for so many years. Not understanding the real role of Petraeus as one who is there to deceive the rest of us. It's like the coverage of Obama, 16 pages in The Guardian, including something that, if it went in for pictures, Pravda, at the height of the Stalinist time, could not have equalled. It had a picture of Obama and the family, who are forever hugging and kissing each other. We know that. Something's wrong. Okay. The best is yet to come. That was the headline. And that's from the serious newspaper. It's funny, but it ain't a joke. Because Obama is not a weak president. Tell that to all those Afghan young people and children and women and all the others that his drones have killed, that he's a weak person. A man who every Tuesday, we are reliably informed by the New York Times, encouraged apparently by the White House, who has a kill list, who ticks them off. And I heard Mark Mardell of the BBC say, well, actually, he's very careful about the people that he decides to assassinate, to murder. And this seduction, this liberal seduction of our readers and of us as journalists and broadcasters, instead of ourselves trying to understand what normalise really means, Edward Herman's great phrase, normalising the unthinkable, and the part that we play in the division of labour in normalising the unthinkable, of perpetual war, of what is going on in the Middle East right now, of minimising the culpability of our own governments, of teaching our young journalists never to look in the mirror of your own societies. We don't actually say that, but that's the message. Always see the demons, always see the criminals, and always see the rapaciousness, if you like, not at home but somewhere else. It's something that runs right through our media colleges. It runs right through our right thinking, a lot of our right thinking colleagues in journalism, and it needs to change if we're going to have a world that actually hears the truth and we tell the truth.
Wise words as ever there from John. So, we will open today with the first of our presentations, and I'd like to introduce to you Professor Piers Robinson from the University of Sheffield, where he is Chair of Politics, Society and Political Journalism. Piers has written some fantastic literature, including a treatise on the Chilcot Report and a book entitled The Handbook of Media, Conflict and Security. Tonight, Professor Robinson will discuss propaganda, deception and the war on terror from 9/11 to Syria. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Robinson.
Okay, I'll just check this technology works before I start. There we go. Okay. Welcome to everybody for coming tonight. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. My presentation is titled Media Failure, Government Propaganda and the War on Terror from 9/11 to Syria. And what I'm going to try and do over the course of the next 15-20 minutes is to try and give some context for the remaining speakers who come after me. And first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about academic insights into the reason why media comes to fail, or can come to fail to play its democratic role in terms of informing the public about what's going on. And I'm going to talk through some of the key factors which academics identify which act as constraints on the mainstream media. I'm then going to use that to segue into a discussion about propaganda and about the problem of propaganda in contemporary liberal democracies. And part of that will be about trying to talk about sort of exactly what propaganda is, exactly why we in the West seem to have such a limited grasp on the importance of propaganda and the manipulation of information around us, and then use it to also just give you an idea of some of the key propaganda techniques which are used within liberal democracies. And then in the latter part of my presentation, I'm going to talk through recent research findings which I've been publishing in the last couple of years, looking at the Chilcot Report in particular, and looking in particular at the war on terror. And what I'm going to do in that second part of the presentation is to try to give some kind of geopolitical context for the conflicts that we've seen over the last 16, 17 years, and hopefully some very important context regarding the propaganda that we all seem to have been subjected to over the last 16 years, and also an insight into the reality of what's been going on in countries such as Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So that's what I'll try and do, and I will try as much as I can to keep to time. First of all, talking about media failure, why does the media fail to live up to its democratic expectations in liberal democracies? Some of you will be familiar with the propaganda model devised by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I strongly recommend that you go and take a look at it at some point, because their propaganda model of the media identifies really the major structural constraints which act on mainstream media in the West. And they're the kind of constraints which stop the media from really speaking truth to power and really giving us an accurate understanding of what's happening in the international system. And they run through a series of filters. I don't want to go into too much detail on these filters, but I'll run through the main ones before I get to what I think is a critical filter that we need to think about when we're thinking about propaganda. But Herman and Chomsky argued that, first of all, if you look at the mainstream media in the West, you're looking at a mainstream media which is dominated by corporations, large concentration of ownership and profit orientation. These are all part of big, powerful economic entities. And that's the first step in starting to understand the potential constraints, because the location of the mass media within large corporations and the overlap of interests between those corporations and governments means that the mainstream media is essentially limited in its ability to challenge those power blocks in society. So whilst there might be a fierce degree of debate in the media over certain issues and so on, it doesn't tend to start to press or to challenge powerful elements within society. The second filter they identify is the reliance upon advertising. The reliance upon advertising makes the media extremely or acutely risk-averse in society. Should I pause for a second?
Yeah, just pause for a second, it's fine. Then we'll just carry on. We'll sort this out.
Yeah.
That these people that are defending freedom of speech in Syria are the ones that dropped skunk water in here. That is a Zionist practice. This is a Christian church that they desecrated. These are extremist supporters in this hall of free speech. Imagine these people given Grad missiles or machine guns. This is the level of extremism that the Syrian people are tolerating and living through every day of their lives. I'm sorry? Thank you also for the support from the audience during that.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys, for standing up there. Meet Syria Solidarity UK. They've turned up to several events and sabotaged them like this, so we're sorry that's happened. We're now going to continue on with Professor Robinson's fantastic talk.
Okay. Okay, so just before I was interrupted, I was talking about reliance upon advertising and mainstream media reliance upon advertising, and advertisers are acutely risk-averse and so on, and that creates a pressure on the kind of news coverage which you see emanating from mainstream media. Some of you are probably familiar with Peter Oborne's experience in the last couple of years with the Telegraph newspaper and his resignation from the Telegraph because it wouldn't run stories in relation to the HSBC scandal and so on, and that's a key advertiser with the Telegraph, which gives you an example of those kind of pressures which can come to bear. Away from these economic constraints which act upon the mainstream media, we have the issue of flack, criticism which gets hurled up at journalists who do start to push at the boundaries and to raise critical issues and so on. Flack being fired up from think tanks and so on, PR outlets, etc., in order to discipline journalists, to intimidate them away from dealing with certain issues. And Herman Chomsky talked also about the importance of anti-communism, at least during the Cold War era, as creating an ideological bond between journalists and policymakers, which meant that they tended to see international politics through the same lens, through the same Cold War lens. So, for example, journalists who were covering the Vietnam War could only see it through the lens of the Cold War, that they were fighting communists, and could never understand it as a conflict against a group of people within Vietnam who were fighting for national self-determination. Of course, there are new ideological filters. There's neoliberalism, for example. There's also the war on terror, which I'll be talking about later, which has similar ideological effects in terms of simplifying the world and creating a bond between journalists and policymakers. So those are the kind of factors which they identify in the propaganda model. The most important one, however, and I'm going to use this now to start talking about propaganda, is actually what is one of the most well-documented and well-established facts in political communication research, which is that journalists, when they're constructing the news, rely heavily upon official sources in order to work out what's going on in the world, and also they rely upon official sources to provide a steady flow of news and information. And this propensity, this tendency of mainstream journalists to use and defer to political elites means that they are acutely vulnerable to propaganda campaigns and the kind of propaganda campaigns that governments engage in, especially in the realm of international affairs, especially during wartime. Propaganda. Let's talk about propaganda. What is propaganda? I'm going to offer a definition here just to give it a little bit of understanding about exactly what we mean. Propaganda involves coordinated approaches to influencing beliefs and behavior and conduct. Okay, so it's organized, it's a directed, intentional activity. And critically, it's not a consensual process. It's not a two-way attempt to persuade people to think in a particular way about an issue. It's essentially, primarily, some kind of manipulative process which appeals to emotions or irrational desires, etc., or involves, at the last point on that slide, some degree of deception or manipulation of information. Propaganda isn't always about deception, but it frequently is, and a lot of the examples which I talk about later on in the talk will be deception-related and so on. But it doesn't just involve deception, but it is essentially, and this is the key point, about a non-consensual process of manipulating people to get them to think or act in a way that they wouldn't act otherwise if they hadn't been subjected to that propaganda. Now, of course, when we talk about propaganda in the West, for a lot of people, perhaps not so many of the people in this audience, but for a lot of people, this doesn't seem to fit. We don't think that we live in a world which is highly propagandized. And when we think of propaganda, we tend to think of these things. So you got a couple of examples there from Nazi propaganda from the Second World War, some US propaganda from the First World War. That's the kind of sort of ideas or images which come to mind when people think of the word propaganda. It's something which happened back there in history and so on. More recently, and I guess with the current debates we've had over the last couple of years regarding fake news and so on, people have come to associate or to use the term propaganda in relation to controversial political actors such as Donald Trump or Nigel Farage. And of course, at the moment, we're in the middle of an extensive debate, crisis, etc., about Russian propaganda and about Russian attempts to influence Western minds and so on. So people are thinking of these things when they hear propaganda, and they're thinking of perhaps propaganda from history, or they're thinking of propaganda coming from external actors or controversial stroke extreme political actors within our own political system. We call it fake news now, but really what we're talking about there is propaganda. But of course, we are actually subjected to propaganda through more legitimate, in inverted commas, media outlets, and from more legitimate, in inverted commas, political leaders. And so a couple of examples there in terms of the political sphere. There's an image there of George Bush having landed aboard an aircraft carrier, mission accomplished at the end of the Iraq War. And the propaganda message which they were trying to articulate there was to send a clear message to the American public that the Iraq War was over, it was done and dusted. And they were also trying to send a clear message to the Iraqi population that they should bow down and accept what had happened to their country. It was a carefully crafted George Bush landing Top Gun style on board an American aircraft carrier and then addressing the world, so to speak. This was carefully designed in order to manipulate perceptions into an understanding that the war in Iraq was over at that point, which, as we all know, that war goes on to this day. In the bottom right-hand corner, perhaps we're more used to sort of manipulation in the commercial sphere, but that's a bit of commercial propaganda there, trying to create an association between cigarette smoking and a benign, positive aspect of life, love, etc. Don't be a maybe, be a Marlboro. So we are subjected to propaganda, but we don't tend to recognize it as such. And this, in some ways, is rather odd in contemporary liberal democracies, because historically, propaganda was widely discussed. And here you have Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud. And he was a group of intellectual thinkers from the early part of the 20th century who spoke extensively about the importance of propaganda in order to mobilize and manage populations in a democracy. The conscious manipulation, intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is key to democracy. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is a true ruling power of our country. So this was widely discussed in the early part of the 20th century amongst intellectuals and academics, the importance of propaganda. But this, over time, has been erased from our minds, or has been removed from the public consciousness that we are subject to propaganda. There are concentrated reasons for this. Eddie Bernays, here's a quote from Eddie Bernays himself, saying that propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans and the way they had used it in the First World War. So what we did was to find a new form of words, PR, public relations. That's where public relations come from. It was a way of rebranding propaganda so that people were not so aware of the manipulation that they were being subjected to. Many people who work in the field of PR studies and so on are blissfully oblivious to the fact that their whole academic research area was actually formerly called propaganda. And it's always great fun pointing that out to them sometimes at conferences. But over time, as Phil Taylor, the war media historian, pointed out and argued, that we've had a euphemism industry which has developed over time. We have a wide range of terms which governments use to explain activities, and I won't read through all of them because I don't have time. We have terms such as psychological operations, strategic communication, influence operations, political warfare, and all of these terms, as Phil Taylor pointed out, are really euphemisms. They're a way of democratic governments and powerful actors within democracies essentially sort of hiding away the fact that they are engaged in manipulation activities, they are engaged in propaganda. A euphemism industry which has led to this wonderful quote here from Carey in his book, Taking the Risk Out of Democracy, Corporate Propaganda versus Freedom and Liberty. Success of business propaganda in persuading us that we are free from propaganda is one of the most significant achievements of the 20th century. So in a very fundamental way, we have had the idea that we're in a society where we are being manipulated, removed from our consciousness and removed from our minds. Now, I'm going to give just a couple of minutes just to give you a little bit of an insight into the rationale that you come across from various stratas within the political establishment, which explains why they believe that propaganda needs to be used in democracies. And this is John Mearsheimer, who's a leading American IR, international relations theorist. And he wrote a book in 2010, Why Leaders Lie. And he argues that deception is widely seen as a necessary component of achieving strategic objectives in the international system. And he makes this wonderfully counterintuitive point that actually countries or states rarely lie to each other. Governments rarely lie to each other because they have intelligence services who can actually work out what the truth of what is going on. But they do frequently lie to their own populations. And there's a kind of an elitist underpinning to this, is that foreign policy elites are there to decide what is in the national interest, what strategic objectives have to be pursued in the international system, and that they're the best place to work out what needs to be done. And you want to keep the public away or keep the public on side through propaganda frequently. And he argues that liberal democracies, and this is perhaps his most controversial point, is that liberal democracies in the international system, whilst they present themselves as benign forces, etc., they do frequently engage in actions in the international system which are fundamentally illiberal. And in order to do that, in order to carry the population with foreign policies which are illiberal and immoral, they will engage in propaganda campaigns to tell positive stories about why they are acting in the international system in the way that they are. Finally there, and I'm slightly conscious of time, we did have an interruption. How am I doing for time? I'm fine, okay, I'm fine. There is an ideological underpinning, and I sometimes think I'm going to ditch this quote for talks and so on, but it's too good a one to avoid. This is Crystal, a neoconservative, talking about truths appropriate for the sophisticated in society and truths appropriate for students and children and sort of lower strata within society. And he says at the end there that sort of the idea in a democracy that all these truths are the same thing is just a lie. It simply doesn't work in a democracy. And what Crystal is really harking back to there is Plato's concept of the noble lie, the idea that there are different stratas in society, and in order to maintain cohesion of society, you do have to engage in systematic propaganda and storytelling to help explain different groups in society why they occupy the positions in society that they do. And these 2 points here, or these 2 slides here, just give you a little bit of an insight into the rationale which underpins the belief in the use of propaganda. This is why we see propaganda being used, because we have people who maintain that position, or from a more practical point of view, people in the foreign policy establishment who just feel that what needs to be done in the international system needs to be sugar-coated for domestic populations. A little bit about propaganda techniques. Lying, people often associate propaganda with lying, the idea of the big lie, the Nazi lie, and so on. But as the German proverb goes, lies have short legs. It tends to be a fairly ineffective way of engaging in propaganda. The political costs associated with being found out in a lie tend to be fatal. So what you tend to find is that in a lot of propaganda activities, you see more subtle forms of manipulation of information, distortion of information, exaggeration, and omission of information. And we saw this very clearly in the run-up to the Iraq War with the debates or the arguments over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And essentially what the British government was involved in was cherry-picking evidence, removing inconvenient facts from the intelligence reports, exaggerating aspects of those intelligence reports in order to create a much greater perception of the threat posed by Iraq's alleged WMD. Misdirection is another classic technique. Getting people to focus on some other issue to take them away from an issue at home. Russiagate at the moment and the focus on Russia and Russian propaganda is arguably, and will probably turn out to be, a very major example of misdirection, trying to take political attention away from politics within the West and put all the blame onto Russia and so on. A couple of further things. When people think of propaganda, they tend to think of PR campaigns, they think of deception, they think of manipulation of information. But propaganda also involves incentivization. It also involves coercive processes. And just as an example of coercive processes, surrender leaflets dropped into war zones, trying to get people to surrender with the implicit threat that force will be used if they don't surrender. Those are seen as part of military psyops and military propaganda. But clearly the coercive meaning of those messages is underpinned by the credible presence of military force and the threat of military force. And a surprising amount of propaganda at the deeper levels does work on that level in terms of coercing people, not just fooling people, but also pressurizing people into acting and behaving in particular ways. Propaganda production and dissemination, written and spoken and visual communication through PR campaigns. I've suggested before that's how often people think of propaganda, etc. But also, propaganda seems to emerge through production of knowledge. Academia, journalists themselves, think tanks can all be caught up and all involved in varying degrees of intentionality in propaganda campaigns. A difficult pill to swallow for academics, a difficult pill to swallow for journalists, for sure. But it's true that there is a degree of penetration into these parts of society which catch them in or involve them with propaganda activities which are being pushed and promoted. And some of the later presentations today, I think, will highlight some of these aspects of propaganda. But propaganda comes out of the production of knowledge through some of these institutions within society. And finally, before I get on to Chilcot, action in the real world. Propaganda is not just about messages, it's not just about the production of knowledge, it's also about doing things in the real world. A very good example of that is the shock and awe strategy in Iraq, and people would probably remember at the start of the Iraq invasion in 2003, the high-profile bombing of government buildings in central Baghdad. That was primarily designed to send a coercive message to the Iraqi population that they should not resist the invasion. It was part of the shock and awe strategy. It was primarily a psyop or a propaganda act. So propaganda also involves doing things as well as saying things, etc. Okay, I want to move now to, in the closing section of this talk, to talk about Chilcot Report. Chilcot Report is an area which I've been researching for 5 years, and I'm going to draw upon Donald Rumsfeld's known knowns here, for those of you who are familiar with that. There are known knowns which have been confirmed by Chilcot in terms of deception and manipulation, and the one there is the one that most of you are probably familiar with, which is the manipulation of intelligence, which I've already mentioned. We know now that there was deliberate propaganda campaign designed to hype the sense of a threat from Iraqi WMD and the headlines produced there. But there are unknown unknowns or known unknowns. Decide which one you want to pick on that one in relation to the war on terror, and that's what I'm going to focus on in the closing few minutes. The Chilcot Report, and this was really very much missed by the mainstream media, the Chilcot Report gave critical information about the emergence of the war on terror, which gives us a powerful insight into the propaganda campaign and the realities of the war on terror. And this is what the Chilcot Report gave us information about for people who actually went through the report and through the details of section 3.1. Here you have a communication from the British Embassy 3 days after 9/11 stating that the regime change hawks in Washington are arguing that a coalition put together to fight the war on terror can be used to clean up other problems in the region. So straight away you have an indication that the war on terror was not simply about what it was claimed to be, which was fighting Al-Qaeda and so on. It was also about doing some geostrategic heavy lifting or taking advantage of 9/11 and Islamic fundamentalism in order to do that. By December 2001, you have documents showing Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the war on terror being planned, and a list of countries there identified for various degrees of action. Here's a document from Tony Blair to George Bush talking about how they might go about toppling Saddam Hussein without a full-blown invasion. And there's reference there to covert operations, trying to stir up uprisings and then militarily intervening when those uprisings occurred. An indicator there, I think, to the possibility of what we've seen in Syria over the last 6 years. Here you have, and this is more damning, here you have Syria and Iran being discussed with Tony Blair saying to George Bush, if the priority is to take out Saddam, then maybe we should do so with Iran and Syria acquiescing rather than hitting all three countries at once. Here you have clear plotting and planning covertly in order to engage in regime change operations in a document from Tony Blair to George Bush. Here you have reference to the propaganda campaign. So politicians don't use propaganda in public, but they do use it in private. And there's reference there by Tony Blair to the need for a tight-knit propaganda campaign. This is another document from an aide from Tony Blair to Condoleezza Rice talking about propaganda activities in the context of the war on terror, the rapid rebuttal, the grid being pushed out, which is an Alistair Campbell device, and so on. And then planning the propaganda campaign, a whole host of activities. For example, humanitarian conference is the first one on the list. And if you look at the first line there, and the terms being used is that this is how to make people in the world think that something good can come from 9/11 and so on. These are all part of the activities to underpin, essentially, an aggressive series of regime change operations. And this confirms, and I'm going to show this clip now, this confirms essentially Wesley Clark's claims, which were made in 2006, which I want to play to you.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Okay. I'm going to run through the next 2 clips. I don't really have time to be talking through these, but just very quickly, Sir Richard Dearlove, if you stop that from playing, yeah.
About Saudi Arabia.
Sorry. So I'm not going to play this clip, but this is a reference from Sir Richard Dearlove. Take the mic off. There we go. This is a reference from Sir Richard Dearlove a couple of years ago talking about a conversation he had with Prince Bandar prior to 9/11, with Prince Bandar clearly indicating the potential emergence of a major conflict within the Middle East and so on. Don't have time to play that clip, but it's very important that you have someone such as Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, passing that information out. And it already sort of underpins and reinforces the remainder of the information from Chilcot that there was clearly regime change planning going on immediately after 9/11. Okay. So I'm just going to be just very clear about what we're seeing here in these documents. We're seeing the leaders of 2 democratic countries. We are seeing them plotting to engage in illegal regime change war operations, wars of aggression, and engaging in planning a propaganda campaign to underpin that. Okay. Concluding comments from what I've been running through today. Propaganda clearly is extensive in liberal democracies, and the case of the Iraq War and the war on terror demonstrates that that's the case. It's extensive in liberal democracies, and it's arguable that there is a permanent and significant displacement of reality because of these propaganda campaigns. The war on terror itself is quite clear from Chilcot and from the insights of people such as Wesley Clark, but also Sir Richard Dearlove, is that the war on terror has essentially been a geostrategic agenda, probably aimed at influence and resources. It's been coordinated in an alliance with key allies in the Middle East, and it's essentially been involved in doing some heavy lifting in the international system, attacking countries who are opposed to the West, invading those countries, and I don't need to add, in the remainder of the presentations we'll talk about this, causing huge loss of life in countries which have been targeted. My final point, Western exploitation and use of Islamic fundamentalism in order to underpin these regime change operations mean that in a very fundamental sense, the war on terror itself, from its inception right through to today, can be understood essentially as a propaganda campaign which has been designed to mobilize Western publics to support these wars which we've been seeing unfolding for the last 16 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Piers. I think you can find a lot of the source material for what Professor Robinson was talking about in his article online, Learning from the Chilcot Report, is that right? Excellent. So, the next presentation of the evening, our next speaker is Robert Stuart. Robert's investigation into the BBC Panorama documentary, Saving Syria's Children, really has been a masterclass in analysis, diligence, and just sheer determination. He's tirelessly highlighted and pursued a series of anomalies which all point towards the documentary being a possible fabrication for the purpose of soliciting public sympathy and support for yet another faux humanitarian intervention in Syria. Robert's work has caught some highbrow attention indeed. Most recently, Emily Thornberry, MP for Islington South and Finsbury. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Robert Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lara. Yes, well, with no further ado, on the 29th of August 2013, just as Parliament was voting on whether to join a US-led military strike on Syria, BBC News at 10 broadcast a report by Ian Pannell and cameraman Darren Conway, which claimed that a Syrian fighter jet had dropped an incendiary bomb on a school playground. I'm going to show an excerpt from that report. This is some of the victims arriving at a nearby hospital. Be warned, it is quite graphic. Here we go.
They arrived like the Walking Dead. We don't know for sure what was in the bomb, but the injuries and debris suggest something like napalm or thermite. There were no shrapnel injuries and little blood, just appalling burns. Among the medics here was a British doctor visiting for the charity Hand in Hand.
I need a pause because it's just absolute chaos and carnage here. We've had a massive influx of what looks like serious burns. It seems like it must be some sort of, and I'm not really sure, maybe napalm, something similar to that. But obviously, in the chaos of the situation, it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on.
This wasn't a chemical weapon, but a so-called conventional one, banned from being used in civilian areas by many countries. But 15-year-old Ahmed's government hasn't signed that treaty.
Dear United Nations, you're calling peace. You're calling for peace. What kind of peace are you calling for? Don't you see this? Don't you see this? What do you need to see? We're just human beings. We want to live, you know? Isn't it our right to live? Isn't it?
In a basic hospital funded by handouts, the emergency beds were full. Patients slumped to the floor, pleading for help, gasping for water.
So it was a very harrowing report, but it struck me as odd, and many other people as well, A month later, the BBC broadcast a panorama programme, Saving Syria's Children, which contained more footage from the incident. And it was at that point that I began corresponding with the BBC using its complaints process, and I also began to conduct my own research. So first, here are the observations of a doctor. She says, "I've watched the Panorama BBC documentary. It makes for interesting viewing, but I think the scene of the school children coming in with the burns was an act. They were able to sit down, be touched by others, even talk. This is not how a severe burn victim would present. Most victims would be screaming the place down in agony. Even after treatment with all sorts of pain drugs, they still hurt and still scream. Most would have difficulties with their airways almost immediately. This shows them able to speak and breathing very well. No obvious signs of respiratory distress like coughing, shallow breathing, etc. Some are shown with skin hanging off, but the flesh beneath is not that convincing. It actually looks like more skin." So just bearing in mind those doctors' comments, I just want to play a section of that report again. Maybe Jack, you could help me. Just play it through a couple of times without sound and just ask yourself, is this real? Play it a couple of times. No. Keep it once more. I just want to play a tiny fraction more. Okay. So I then made contact with some investigators inside Syria, and they conducted some interviews and provided these statements. This first one is from a local resident. "We never had something like that, a napalm bomb that is. Never, never, nor did we ever hear about it." This from a Free Syrian Army commander. "We, the fighters of the Free Syrian Army in the northwest areas of the city of Aleppo, we declare that we were present in this region in August 2013, and we did not meet with any airstrike with the substance of napalm on al-Kubra or on any other region in the northwest Aleppo countryside." And of course, you would expect somebody in the Free Syrian Army to enthusiastically endorse anything which painted the Syrian government in a bad light. So what about the time of the attack? Well, as you can see, there's a 6-hour range, starting from midday, going all the way through to 6 p.m., all from supposedly credible, reliable sources. What's interesting about that is that the two-man team of Ian Pannell and Darren Conway, they're in the middle, they don't particularly seem to agree. Darren Conway, I don't know, between 3 and 5, something like that. Ian Pannell, more categoric at around 5:30 p.m. at the end of the school day. So a 6-hour range of when this incident is supposed to have occurred. I mean, is that plausible? Let's look at this, this woman. She's in the BBC report. She's at the gate here with her father, covered in the white cream. There is footage available of her, I found on YouTube. And this is at the start of the, she's at the scene of the attack, the alleged attack. She's walking towards the ambulance. She's walking upright, unaided. She climbs in. She has to get up 2 steps to get into the side door of the ambulance. And once inside, she takes an upright seat. I'll go through this again in a moment. Then she's filmed by the BBC. It's a 13-kilometre journey. She's then filmed by the BBC, at which point she apparently has to be stretchered out of the back of the ambulance by 5 men, apparently screaming in agony, having lost the use of her legs. She goes inside, has some white cream put on her face, and she's back outside on her feet, and indeed stamping her feet in rage. So, I mean, is this a plausible sequence of events? And just to let you know, the YouTube footage, although it's not very clear, all the analysis is on my blog. It's the same ambulance, it's the same people accompanying this woman, it's the same woman. There's no doubt about that. This scene from Ian Pannell's report of victims arriving at the hospital, we're looking at this boy on the right. Okay, so just want your first impression. How would you describe his expression? Jovial. Well, compare with what are certainly, we know are certainly genuine napalm victims. There is no comparison. I mean, in fact, there are just far too many contradictions and inconsistencies in the footage itself and in the various accounts of the event. I haven't got time to go into them all. They're all on my blog if you want to check them out. This is just a very small selection. I'll just present this. So the two doctors in the report don't seem to be able to agree where they were when the victims began arriving at the hospital. One of them says, I was sitting on the hospital balcony, drinking my 5th cup of sweet sugary tea. The other doctor, we had just come out of the basement of the hospital because a warplane was flying above. Well, I mean, clearly at least one of those accounts is incorrect. And I just want to add that the BBC is very diligently blocking on YouTube all copies of Saving Syria's Children. So you won't find it on YouTube, you won't find any footage from it. Any footage that goes up from that programme is taken down within a matter of hours. And that's not the case with any other Panorama programme. So let's move on to the background of these two doctors. So this is Dr. Rola Halam. She is a British Syrian medic. She's the medical director of Hand in Hand for Syria, the charity which is featured in the report. She's there taking time out to give an interview during a mass casualty scenario. I need a pause because it's just absolute chaos and carnage here. Here she is on Newsnight. Now, this is a day after the government lost the vote on military intervention in Syria, and here's Dr. Halam expressing her disappointment. I feel that the world has failed Syria for the last 2.5 years. Now is the time to act. So she has a political point of view. The BBC nowhere tells us that her father is also politically involved at a very high level. This is her father on Al Jazeera, describing how he lobbied attendees at the 2012 Friends of Syria summit to arm the Syrian opposition. Either you defend us or you arm the Syrian Free Army to defend us. You have the choice. Now, Dr. Halam's charity is Hand in Hand for Syria. Their logo just is the opposition flag. You'll have had a good look at it earlier. It's exactly the same. They dropped the stars in 2014, but the influence is, and presumably the allegiance, is still very clear. This is a UK-registered charity. This is a Hand in Hand for Syria employee. This is at the same hospital where Saving Syria's Children was filmed. So this chap posted images such as this on his Facebook page, but he's also something of a multitasker. I sent these images to the Charity Commission, and they responded, "The issues raised within your emails do not raise sufficient regulatory concern." Yeah. Yes, okay. The other doctor in Saving Syria's Children is Salia Hassan, you may recognise. So she is in the programme. She and Dr. Halam are visiting Hand in Hand for Syria's hospitals in the north of the country. And she's enjoyed a flourishing career with the BBC since then, including as a presenter on Trust Me, I'm a Doctor. We see from the bio there that she's a former British Army captain who served in Bosnia. BBC viewers might be a little startled to see that she also considers herself something of a revolutionary. I came out to support the revolution. She's talking about Libya here. Then I worked in the hospital to look after the wounded fighters. A year after Saving Syria's Children aired, Dr. Astan presented this report on Newsnight, and it's about HOSPEX, which is a casualty simulation exercises, highly sophisticated casualty simulation exercises, which are aimed at preparing British Army Medical Services personnel for deployment. And I'm just going to play a few clips from this, and I think you'll see why my ears pricked up.
This is Camp Bastion Hospital, but it isn't Afghanistan, it's York. Here, the Army have set up a simulation of the entire military field hospital. These medics are the last hospital team who will be deployed to Afghanistan, where they'll face casualties for real. I'm Salia Hassan. I served in the British Army for 4 years. Now I'm an emergency medicine doctor in the NHS, and I've come to see what civilian medicine can learn from medical simulation at this level. It's a method called macro simulation, replicating exactly the conditions medics will face in the field. today starts with a helicopter rescue. In charge of the whole operation is Doctor and Army Brigadier Kevin Beaton. He was my squadron commander in Bosnia and inspired me to study medicine. The principle behind macro simulation is that it's as close to reality as possible. Actors and makeup artists mimic even the most severe of injuries.
Here we've got a casualty that we're making up with multiple fragmentation wounds, mostly to both lower limbs. So we've got smaller peppering, and then we've got quite a substantial degloving to the foot at this side.
It's looking quite gruesome already, but it is fake, it's not real.
Okay, so this is the company who provided the makeup effects we just saw in that report. And from their website, we learn that they are specialists in simulating chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear injuries. And they support various military forces internationally and can easily travel international as they're a mobile team and can work in any location. In its final reply to my complaint, the BBC said that it was likely impossible for such a report as the one I was complaining about to have been staged on the front line of an ongoing conflict. Well, perhaps, but perhaps there are companies such as this one who can travel as a mobile team and work in any location. I just want to say, it is fake, it's not real. Here's some of their work. Highly unpleasant, including a very death-like corpse. And so let's just compare Hospex with Panorama. Okay, so I just want to conclude by a fairly recent development. I hadn't spotted this, but in an earlier part of the programme, Ian Pannell and Darren Conway are travelling to the front line with a security escort. And from a shot inside one of the convoy vehicles, we can see this logo on the front of one of the cars. Now, this is a group called Ahrar al-Sham. I didn't really know who they were. So who are they? Well, the group aims to create an Islamic state under Sharia law, and in the past has cooperated with the Al-Nusra Front, an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. A leading figure, its co-founder, according to some sources, was Abu Khalid al-Suri, real name Mohammed Bahaya, killed by an ISIS suicide bomb in 2014. He was Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri's main representative in Syria, and Spanish investigators identified him as one of Osama bin Laden's most trusted couriers. In fact, the Spanish think that this guy delivered surveillance tapes of the World Trade Center and other American landmarks to Al-Qaeda's senior leadership in Afghanistan in 1998. And what do the BBC have to say about Ahrar al-Sham? Well, numerous BBC reports describe it as a hardline Islamist group, and yet this is the very group that Ian Pannell and Darren Conway, the BBC Panorama team, are, if not embedded, shall we say, ensconced. Furthermore, 3 weeks before Saving Syria's Children began filming, Ahrar al-Sham took part in attacks in Latakia on the Syrian coast, in which 190 civilians, including women, children, and elderly men, were killed, and 200, mostly women and children, were kidnapped. And this is from a Human Rights Watch report, which identifies 5 groups who are the key fundraisers, organisers, planners and executors of these attacks, and they include Ahrar al-Sham and ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, aka Al-Nusra Front, aka Al-Qaeda. And this was 3 weeks before filming began on Saving Syria's Children, and just a few days over 3 weeks before Ian Pannell and Darren Conway were riding in a car with them. So 3 questions for the BBC, at least. Were Ian Pannell and Darren Conway aware of the links between Ahrar al-Sham, Al-Qaeda and ISIS when they travelled with them? It's kind of hard to imagine they wouldn't be. Did any of the men accompanying Pannell and Conway participate in the killing and kidnap of civilians in Latakia 3 weeks earlier? Well, if not those individuals, certainly their comrades. And was BBC licence fee payer money paid to the hardline Islamist Arar al-Sham? Now, just to conclude, I sent these concerns to my local MP, who happens to be Emily Thornberry, and just the other day I had this response. I've written to the editor of BBC Panorama to alert them to your complaint. Making programmes in a war zone such as Syria is a very difficult task, but I agree that the BBC must be vigilant to ensure that licence fee payer money is never used to inadvertently fund the members of any jihadi groups. Well, inadvertently or advertently, I might put it. I hope that the editor of Panorama will be able to shed further light on this issue and explain what action the BBC has taken to look into this matter and learn lessons for future programmes. And so as soon as I get a reply from the BBC, I shall post it on my blog. That's the address, a bit of a mouthful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. You can see all of Robert's full investigation and in-depth analysis at his blog on WordPress. Really do suggest you go over and have a look at that. Our next speaker tonight is Tim Hayward, Professor of Environmental Political Theory at the University of Edinburgh, where he is also Director of the Just World Institute. Tonight, Professor Hayward discusses the catch-all derogatory term conspiracy theory and posits that maybe being a conspiracy theorist is not such a bad thing after all. So please let's put our hands together for Professor Tim Hayward.
Good evening. Just wait for this to load. It's strange that a professor of environmental political theory from Edinburgh is here talking about media on trial. I think it's fair to say this past 9 months, past 10, 11 months, I've learned as much as I did probably my first year of life. And it all started, thanks to Vanessa's friend, and then Vanessa herself, of course, for making me realise that our media were not entirely telling the truth about everything. Because I'm a professor, that hadn't quite dawned on me up until that point, because studying philosophers, they 200 years ago, still quite a new idea in some ways for us. We take a while to catch on. So I could put myself in the place of people, probably unlike most of the people in this room, who are way ahead of me. Most of us are way behind you in understanding just how much we're being deceived. But the situation in Aleppo, I think, was quite a litmus test for a lot of people, because there you had two competing stories, and then you had immediately afterwards a test of which one was telling the truth. And that was a very significant moment for me personally, but I think also for the world, and clearly a very major historic turning point in all sorts of ways. So that's kind of prompted me being involved. I started doing blogging, which was just letting off a little bit of steam, really. But it was found to resonate with quite a lot of people in the public, and they said, well, it's good that someone who's got credentials is saying this, because otherwise we get dismissed as crazy conspiracy theorists. So that's what I'm talking about this evening, because I'll explain as we go along. I've been writing a blog about this as well, but if I can get the technology, there's this thing, is it? Who's afraid of conspiracy theory? As mainstream media lose our trust, we as citizens have to decide who to believe. And independent journalists give us a choice. And at the moment, we have this choice because we can hear them speak, places like this, we can hear them speak on social media, and certain, I think, foreign TV channels still. But I wouldn't... I think we should be aware that we're enjoying this freedom of speech at the moment, and it's not something that has always been there, and it's not something necessarily that always will be there. And this is quite a disturbing thought. The journalists on the platform, this part and the second part, are all often called conspiracy theorists. That's something that we know if we just see what's said in the media. But what about the academics? And we have an ambassador, a former ambassador as well. I just want to show you that everyone is become liable to be called a conspiracy theory. I'm feeling... Sorry, we'll give some examples. There's Times journalist on Peter Ford. He is accusing him of endorsing a conspiracy theory. Then we have a Times journalist on Piers Robinson, who refers to him as an academic in journalism, who turns out to be a 9/11 conspiracy theorist. He also touts obscure pro-Assad blogger. And there's a Guardian journalist on me. Well, a Twitter follower of his is advising him, because I had a little bit of debate with George Monbiot, someone I respect greatly, and that's why I wanted to have a debate with him. But this Twitter follower of his advised him, because he kind of disagreed with me, that I write for the conspiracy blog 21st Century Wire, which is represented here this evening, which also denied climate change, and I consort with Vanessa Beeley. My wife might be seeing this. We share a platform sometimes. But George Monbiot said this explains a lot. Now, this is just a casual tweet. It's not like a major treatise he's offering here. But it's just typical of the throwaway comments that people make. And ordinary people who might say something can get very easily dismissed and discouraged and disheartened when this kind of throwaway comment's made. I'm not saying that I do, but I can understand it can have an effect. I asked George what it explained. Then you become slightly weary, because they've heard it all before. It's depressingly familiar to anyone involved in climate wars. People dismissing a weight of evidence that they're not even aware of. And I think that's a puzzling kind of attitude, because I put it to him in a tweet back. Could he name actually a climate scientist who would accept this report as evidence of the Syrian government's responsibility? Now, this debate was about the Khan Sheikhoun chemical incident in April. And I'd make the point that where there'd been a rush to judgment on the part of all the governments very quickly that Assad was to blame, I said, well, that we don't actually have evidence really to establish that. And I think if you're taking a more systematic, a more, academic approach, you would be reserving judgment. You'd be waiting to see where the evidence was leaving you. Well, George was saying, I judge a case by the evidence, which sounds good, wherever it might take me, which also sounds good, and from the start, the evidence has been compelling. From the start, before any investigations. How do you know before the evidence is even investigated? You just trust what you're told. So, my point would be, we've seen Robert, his presentation, the amount of sheer investigative forensic analysis he puts in. Robert isn't the only person doing this kind of work. He's made a particular focus on saving Syria's children, but people are doing very serious kinds of investigation, including into the chemical attacks. As a result of my starting to blog, a colleague of mine at Edinburgh University, who apparently, it turned out, has been looking at these matters for some time, was in touch with lots of people with expertise in chemistry who'd been studying these attacks in Syria and raised very serious questions about the mainstream narrative on every single one of them, including this latest one. So, serious conspiracies requires serious conspiracy theory. But the conspiracy deniers, they like to trivialize it. What you've got here is a picture which came from Bellingcat's debunking of anyone that raises any questions about that particular attack. And this article is saying what you have to believe in order for it to have been a false flag operation. And you see the picture there, it's various kinds of tinfoil hat to show all the kinds of weirdos and wackies that would believe these things. Well, actually, it's not for him to say what we need to believe, because it's for people to arrive at their own hypotheses. And this is something that Paul McKeague, my colleague that I spoke of, helped me see. And he wrote some guest blogs on my blog, and he's using methods that were thought up by Bayes, adapted by Alan Turing. You may remember Alan Turing actually was good enough at figuring out probabilities to crack the Enigma code and turn the course of World War II. So he's using methods with some degree of robustness to look at the hypotheses. So you have a choice as a citizen to follow the authorised narrative and just accept it and be compelled from the start, or to have a look at what people who take a more critical method have to say. Now, I'm not trying to say that just because you have a more impressive method, it means you're right. All I'm trying to say is that the people who are doing so-called conspiracy theory may have a point, and that point is worth taking seriously. And the thing about conspiracy is, if it was easily discovered, it wouldn't be a very good conspiracy, would it? So they have to be a little bit difficult. They have to seem improbable. That's the whole point of it. And that's where good old Sherlock Holmes comes in to remind us with his principle that actually the approach to take is a much more calm and rational one. Once you've eliminated the impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, it must be the truth. So that's sometimes called the Sherlock Holmes principle. It's actually a simplification. What the scientists do is the print becomes too small to read, but it's about weighing hypotheses and probabilities. But the point is essentially the same, that it can surprise you. You don't always assume that something's not happened just because it seems improbable. And in the nature of the case, conspiracies are supposed to seem improbable. Unfortunately, some of these false flag operations, when you think what these improbable explanations involve, it can be truly shocking and horrifying. That's the really scary thing, but that is what might be hidden. So my point is, I'm not saying that a professor from Edinburgh knows better than Nikki Haley in the United States. What I'm saying is that we do not know for sure either way until it has been properly investigated. The question's an open one. A right to question is protected as freedom of expression. And working as an academic, I feel particularly jealous in guarding freedom of expression. As a citizen, I think it's really important that we have freedom of expression. So, should governments try to disrupt our efforts? Should the media be complicit in such an attempt? Well, here's where I get disturbed, with my day job hat on, because there are actually academics who think conspiracy theory should not be protected under freedom of expression. We have here an example, perhaps a particularly egregious example, but this political philosopher, legal philosopher, is one of the most famous, influential in the world, Cass Sunstein. He wrote about conspiracy theories. He wrote about their causes, and he wrote about some cures that he proposed for them. But he's not just any philosopher. I can do my philosophizing all I like, and not many people pay much attention. Look whose ear he had. Look at two people's ears he has. In his writings on this subject, he asks the question, how can government dispel conspiracy theories? How can it stop people asking these questions, citizens doing these kind of investigations? That is essentially what I'm seeing he's asking here. And he has answers to this by enlisting independent groups to supply rebuttals, for example, which, independent, if they're good, that sounds good, but look actually what happens in practice. One of my very first blogs was looking at Amnesty International reports on Syria, and I was very surprised at how those reports from around 2012 didn't conform or follow remotely the research methods that were laid down for Amnesty International. That's what it's supposed to be doing. As an academic, the kind of geeky thing you can do is you can see whether they're using the methods that they say they're using, and they simply weren't. And it was pointed out to me, well, that same year, Amnesty International USA, which was producing these reports, was being headed by this person, Suzanne Nossel. I think you can see on the board her pedigree. I think you can see how she is part of Sunstein's answer to the problem of what you do about people who don't follow the main line. You get in there and you supply it. And another strategy, which anybody who follows Twitter and perhaps Facebook to some extent as well, may have some knowledge of. I dare say people in this room have come across it. Cognitive infiltration, it's called, of groups that produce conspiracy theories. So if people start getting a little bit too close to the truth with their inquiries, you get people, trolls, astroturfers, all these other kinds of new species that we have, they come along and muddy the waters. Now, I'm not going to go into doing the typology or ethnography of all these kinds of individuals. What I want to do is just make a simple point as a political philosopher. If we live in a democracy, if we live somewhere where freedom of expression is actually valued, then we have a state, we have a tradition, a set of beliefs which are very straightforward and clear. John Stuart Mill, the 19th century political philosopher, he set out these principles. Now, I'm not saying we should all be liberals, I'm not saying he was right about anything, but people that talk about this being a liberal democracy and being protected, if they disagree with what he said, they should have a reason for it. And he said the only reason that you should ever prevent freedom of speech is to prevent direct incitement of harm. And you shouldn't prevent people speaking at all if they're just publishing opinions in the newspapers. Because whatever you might think about it, however extreme you might find it, however wrong you might find it, if it's not actually provoking someone to do some harm, there are very many good reasons just to allow it to be said. So it's quite worrying when very indirect kinds of harm and threat are started to use as reasons to curtail freedom of speech. The idea of actually preventing people, actually infiltrating people who are trying to do the kind of thing that Robert's doing, for me is abhorrent as a philosopher and as a citizen. And I think we need to be aware, we need to be recovering a sense of confidence. I see people say on Facebook, for example, they've lost friends, they've even fallen out with members of their family because they've taken the kind of stance that people on this platform take with regard to matters of the truth. It's serious for lots of people. So I think, as an academic, the least that I can do is give support to people who's doing nothing other than simply seeking the truth. And because originally scheduled to follow me at this point was John Pilger, I thought it appropriate to have his photo here, but it's certainly in any case appropriate to echo the sentiment. Always look for the truth from the ground up, rarely from the top down. Journalists are never real journalists if they are the agents of power, no matter how they disguise that role. Real journalists are agents of the people.
Thank you very much, Tim. I really do recommend that you visit Tim Hayward's blog on WordPress. There are several really, really interesting articles, and they're all quite concise and easy to read as well. So that's it for the first half of this evening. I think we've seen some really, really interesting presentations. They've been fantastic. It's been nice to have a mix of academia and media analysis, all focusing the lens on the same thing. That's been really interesting. So we're going to have a strict 10 minutes for the break, guys. We've got snacks, cold drinks and snacks for sale in the foyer and down here at the front. See you in 10 minutes.